essentially at the core of my research was looking at how the potential role of humanitarian organizations and of course NGOs as well in facilitating the social integration of refugees. And it stemmed from UNHCR's study, which was seeking to understand the role that those organizations play in facilitating those pathways and building good social connections between host community and refugees, and indeed immigrants and migrants in general. Very briefly, like the European context and the Irish context, there's a lot of that will overlap. With its dealing of asylum and immigrants in general, there's like a two-pronged approach. It's very two-faced. So in one sense, it says this European movement towards shared responsibility, which is moral and sustainable. And we saw a real sort of turning point in Europe when poor Alian, the boy, washed ashore on a beach on Turkey. And there was a huge sort of rise in solidarity and sympathy for refugees. And in Ireland specifically, we polled really high for sort of positive views towards immigrants generally and of course refugees. But then on the other side, you have the issue of then there's a fixation on deterrence, so what's called Fortress Europe. And Ireland is very much guilty of that. The Irish Times published an article today which kind of outlines a lot of that, so I encourage you guys to read that. But essentially, it's very hugely disappointing because initially we have this huge solidarity and momentum that the government and its integration strategy essentially has squandered, and it's taken that goodwill and solidarity for granted. And it's sad to say that a lot of the momentum has been lost, but maybe we can bring it back. So I've included this quote here just because I think it's really important for the conversation about humanitarian organizations, but NGOs, and that includes Global Citizenship Education. Like if we're looking at global displacement and how we manage asylum, the current global system isn't sustainable, and it's unfair that if we don't have that shared responsibility, that the global south bear the burden. I'm sorry to use that term when I'm talking about groups of people, but that's essentially how Europe and the West and the global north are sort of framing it. And I'm saying it's not sustainable that refugees are put into overcrowded refugee camps. There needs to be a proactive approach to how we bring about shared responsibility. And that means working with local communities, and it means fostering that real solidarity on the ground. And maybe we have to change and adapt our approach to sort of refugee crisis. Of course, there's my research question, and I had a series of objectives. A lot of them was like looking at how do we define integration in the Irish context, because often it's a goal, a policy goal, but what does that actually mean? And what does diversity mean? So that was the research design. And then the two main questions that I want as framing in this webinar is it a domain? What can we do? What's the potential humanitarian action and NGO space? And of course, development educator space and community action in regards to that. So when we look at integration, I know the Irish government have community sponsorship and other approaches to integration that amalgamate both hard and soft indicators for integration, but by and large the integration strategy is focused on those hard indicators. And what I mean by that is if you're a refugee, say you have a job, you're housed, your children are in school, and you have a medical card or you're registered at a GP, you tick all those means and marks and makers and all those, but are you necessarily integrated in your society? The answer is no. You're probably isolated. I'm looking at the psychosocial, the social connection element, the soft indicators of integration, which the government tends to ignore. And that's done for a number of reasons, but I think it's because if I was to summarize it in a sentence, the government is quite neoliberal and for decades has had this approach that it's treated society like an economy. So if GDP is up, that doesn't really translate to the people's lives, and they've neglected then the community aspect of society. And I'll explain why that's kind of obviously problematic and how it's sort of helped build fertile ground for the far right to get a foothold in. To do this, I focused collecting data, and I want to thank everyone actually that contributed to the data in this research. And I know a lot of them are watching. And so I broke them into three categories. The first one was to look at experts and local groups and NGOs on the ground who are working for and with refugees and immigrants generally, and then the sort of strictly defined humanitarian organizations in the sector. And then, of course, I got state representatives and from the Irish refugee resettlement program. And so what I wanted to do is, by collecting their data, I wanted to collect, well, what is the meaning of integration according to these stakeholders, and also what are the problems and challenges that we have in facilitating integration. Very briefly, the core of what I found was that according to the data set, social inclusion is at the core of social integration, and that's what we should strive to. But of course, there are other elements, and it's quite context specific. And integration is it's not static, it will change as cultures change. It's constantly like in motion. But when we look at the barriers, the major one is preparation and planning. And this would boil down to things like not assessing stress levels in areas housing refugees, lack of mainstream and intercultural training in state and local services. I found this in my own research, but the Immigrant Council of Ireland did an amazing evaluation of local authorities and saw that they either were not aware of their integration strategy, they're lacking in progress in intercultural sort of approaches to integration. So very, very messy and not delivered. And it kind of boils down to not being prioritized. And direct provision, I gather that I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but that's clearly not a good case for integration. It's diversified both physically and symbolically, but I'm sure MASI can speak in greater detail there. Language is not just that refugees and immigrants come with poor English levels. It's also lack of access or consistent training and services. That was something that constantly came up. Racism for obvious reasons, and that kind of ties in with the far right narrative. Not cross-sectional. That was a huge finding that they're not, the government and strategies and resettlement strategies of refugees are not really working with local communities on the ground, which is a huge oversight. And one of the major findings there was that the youth sector were largely ignored in the resettlement process of refugees, like basic stuff that was just like not utilized and not adapted. Silo and separation is an interesting one, and that's down to things like host community employers recognizing the skills of refugees and immigrants. And there's actually like a disconnect, like just the awareness of it and not being, and that leads then to underemployment. And so across Ireland, we see that even in work, it's quite siloed. And a good example would be sort of the meat factories in Ballyhornis. They're very like immigrant centered. And there's a bit of a disconnect then with the local community. And so you kind of like, well, how do we bring those, if work is not a place that there can be sort of crossover? So a lot of these then funding and resources is a big one. Again, I'm preaching to the choir. We all know that NGO sector, community sector by large, always is sort of dipping our cap and looking for the scraps sometimes. But when the government do integration strategies and they have a funding for community projects, again, they're very focused on those hard indicators, those milestones and sort of measurable outcomes. And then the soft projects that are about building trust, community, dispelling myths, countering disinformation, very social things, very difficult to measure. The pre-development work, which will build solidarity, that's kind of neglected. And that's been a huge failing. And it's definitely led to what we're seeing now with, far right people on our ballot forms, managing expectations. This is even when looking at like how we view refugees. Sometimes it's problematic in like that all refugees are going to be Albert Einsteins, and that approach is not right. They're people just like everyone else, and managing expectations as well. As if you're a Syrian moving to a rural town, there's like power dynamics there. There's a concept of indebtment, like how long are you expected to stay in a place that sort of gave you refuge? Like these are conversations that everyone across the board, the people who have goodwill, their expectations need to be managed and refugee expectations need to be managed. Like everyone needs to be treated like on the level playing field with equity where there's imbalance. Education upskilling, again, it's like work-life balance, underemployment, utilizing when they're getting language learning, instead of just being in a hotel or an EROC center, that they are volunteering with tidy towns and they're learning language English through interaction. And that's then giving more pathways to integration there. Miscommunication is a big one. We're hearing that in the news from local communities that they're saying, no one consulted us. And there is some righteous anger there, and families are just literally dumped in rural areas, and there's no sort of assessments made, consultations, a huge oversight. Evidence-based like approaches with community sponsorship, are there actual research to say that this is the best approach? That's the thing. So as well as the NGO sector, the development education sector, academics, researchers, we all need to be consulted, and it needs to be a big brainstorm and a collaborative effort. I could go on about appropriate service, like that's not happening. Like there's been cases in EROC centers that like they're not being properly trained, they lack intercultural training, all of this sort of stuff. I touched briefly on the power dynamics here, gender, the fact that there needs to be nuance, there has to be intersectionality. Refugee hierarchy was a huge one. As you can imagine, when I was first halfway through my research, I was only dealing with sort of program refugees and Syrians. And even then there was that refugee hierarchy and sort of the unfair treatment of Syrians versus other asylum seekers and refugees. Like that was problematic in itself. And then the Ukraine crisis happened, and then like the whole structure got totally scrapped, and Ukrainian teachers were able to be fast-tracked into employment if they were teachers. Things like this were very problematic on the ground, and making that sort of hierarchy, and I'm sure MASI can speak on that much better than I. Visibility, being cut off, indebtment, and imbalance, all of these things have to be considered in the strategy, and working with local communities, building that community. And then it goes to where the NGO sector and local groups can really build and work, is they come with skills that in the middle they can utilize and build that grassroots support and solidarity. And I can explain a few of those recommendations now. Briefly, very touching on the meaning of integration just across the data set. It was like looking at like social capital and also social inclusion, looking at the hard indicators, so addressing the structural barriers. But then it was all about navigation and guidance through the system and social networks and support. So when I'm looking at the structure of resettlement, I touched already on the preparation and planning. Formalized role is a really good one to point out. So in the resettlement process, you would have like an integration officer, but they would have like a short-term contract. So they would build up a lot of knowledge and trust on the ground in these local communities. They were supposed to be doing all those consultations and needs assessments of local capacities, by the way. But then you see their contract was cut, and then there was loads of inactivity where Syrians weren't coming in intervals anymore. And then they obviously moved on and got new jobs. And then a new officer came in, and all that progress was lost, and they start from square one. It's just very counterproductive. That's why we needed like a formalized role with people who are trained and appropriate, not civil servants. Like, they have to be specific to sectors, and they could be outsourced, they could be consultants with the humanitarian or community sector. This whole webinar is about brainstorming those ideas. The fact that we need collaboration, I talked about exclusion. And the local recommendations, this is where the development, DevEd, and global citizenship sector can really come into. We need to start creating space for dialogue, and that's when the real important conversations around diversity and building those growth integration interactions, which are really important. And if it comes from the sector like ourselves, the community sector, that comes from a place of solidarity, of openness, inclusivity, and building those positive interactions, we can really make a difference, at the grassroots level. And I even think at a top level, looking at, like a citizens' assembly, very similar to how we discussed issues like Repeal the Eight, that we're discussing it, we're talking about, and we have a whole society collaborative approach, voice and participation, your street councils, your tidy towns, who are the decision makers there? Is it diverse? Like, it's all well and good having quotas, but who's the decision makers? Who's the idea? The local leaders. Again, go into those local leaders. The NGO sector, the humanitarian sector, can build on those organic, natural momentum for solidarity and anti-xenophobia and racism. And we're actually seeing that. So I'm really happy that when I was writing this, I was encouraging it, and it's naturally gone that way. I know Oxfam and the Irish Refugee Council are working with local groups on the ground to build that solidarity. East Wall for All, building capacity, how you counter the far right. Again, pre-development work, the soft indicators lost both in funding, but also structural sort of strategies. And then again, approach to integration. And then finally, what can we do as the humanitarian sector? Well, we already have a structure. The Irish Refugee and Migrant Council, a coalition, was set up by the Irish Refugee Council. And I encourage you to look them up, look it up. A lot of the NGO sector had signed up for that, encourage quotas, but also the participation of local communities in that integration. They also have the best practice and expertise, so we can upskill local leaders to build that advocacy, whether it's to help them, how do they apply for EU funding to build community projects. Like, we can brainstorm and use our skill sets to grow domestic solidarity and integration on the ground. Advocacy and lobby, the NGO sector does that anyway with, right, family reunification, things like that. But it can be done the same way, building the capacity of local groups as well. I touched on capacity building, again, development education. A lot of the time, I know Troca, for example, visit schools, do development education. They talk about the refugee crisis, but they talk about the refugee crisis away internationally, when they should be also centering it here in Ireland, because we have refugees in Ireland and they have the stories, they have the global politics. People need to know. Also, dispelling misinformation and media literacy. All of these things are really important to countering the far right, but also building solidarity, understanding that there's righteous anger, but it needs to be directed in the right way. That austerity is not the fault of the refugee and asylum seeker, or an immigrant for that matter. It's, lack of social housing. Ireland isn't full. It's been mismanaged. That sort of perspective and discussion on these topics is really, really needed. Again, pre-development work. The soft indicators, because they're not measurable, economic, they're just disregarded. And mediation, that shared safe space to have those important questions, that we're not burying our heads in the sand. What we don't want to do is end up like France and Britain, where we don't have a good conversation, where we're building inclusivity, talking about diversity and a shared Ireland that's for all. Those conversations need to happen. And finally, any strategy needs to be preventive, as in for any like exclusion, but it needs to be proactive. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, it's always, like most of what the government does, it's reactive. And the shit has already hit the fan. And we're seeing now that the far right, although small, is becoming more volatile. And now is the time that we really need to get our act together. And a lot of that's going to start from the ground and grassroots with the NGO sector, because we have a brilliant NGO sector here in Ireland. It's just that it's not being utilized formally from the top. Thank you very much for listening to me. I know I threw a lot at you all at once.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bulelani Mfaco. I'm going to try to be very brief. Some of the slides will include pictures, so apologies for anybody who is, and there are a few graphs, and apologies for anybody who is colorblind, but I will explain some of the data that I'll be talking about. So when we look at Ireland's hosting of asylum seekers, generally Ireland did not have any experience of hosting people who spontaneously arrived at Irish ports of entry. Historically, refugees came to Ireland by invitation of the state. We know this from the response to Bosnia, the response to Vietnam, the response to Jewish refugees in the 1950s. All of those people were brought into Ireland with the agreement of the state. And only much later on, as Ireland got more interconnected with the rest of the world, more available flights from other parts of the world, it allowed for people who were seeking safety to come to Ireland. And we see from the data that from the 90s, it only started peaking around 1996, where you had more than 1,000 people, which was for the first time Ireland had people spontaneously arriving on its shores to seek asylum. And when you look at this graph, you will notice that whenever there is an increase in the number of people coming into Ireland, the rhetoric from government started to change around who is to be welcomed here and who is not to be welcomed. Around the 1997 period, they started talking about people coming here, for instance, to claim for island social welfare benefits, but also economic prosperity of Ireland. They used that as something that was attracting people, of course, ignoring all the global events that were happening around the world that pushed people to flee for their lives. And so we note that whenever there is an increase, there's always that shift in tone, and that language of deterrence that Joe spoke about earlier on becomes much more prevalent. Last year, Ireland received the highest number of asylum seekers ever. It was 13,277 people who came here to seek asylum. And that caused, again, that same panic that we saw when Ireland introduced the system of direct provision, that people were coming here for welfare benefits, which is not true, because asylum seekers are actually not entitled to any welfare benefits. They would be put into a direct provision center, and we currently know that there are more than 20,000 people in the direct provision system. Some of them already have refugee status here, subsidiary protection or leave to remain, which gives them the same access to public services as Irish citizens, but are struggling to get out of the system because they've been there for a long time, but also they struggle to find housing, which is something the government is not talking about at the moment. They're all talking about ways that they can deter people from coming to Ireland rather than addressing some of the challenges that are causing people to end up sleeping on the streets. So if you see on these stats, for those who are colorblind, on my right screen, I see blue, which is single men. And that's the group that's been targeted by both the far right organizers, single unvetted men. They call us single unvetted men of fighting age. And they will tell you that the vast majority of people coming to Ireland are single men, but actually not true. Even amongst the people the government calls single, many of them aren't single. They have families. They could be married men, but the fact that they came here on their own, the state assumes that they are single and will tick that they are single. Some of them will later apply for family reunification, for instance, once they've been given status. Some of their families aren't even in their country of origin. They could be scattered all around the world. You have quite a lot of that amongst Syrians. You have quite a lot of that amongst Zimbabweans in particular. Those are the only ones that I would know of personally, who would have families in Canada, in Australia, in the UK, in America, in South Africa, and in other parts of the world. They are scattered not by choice, but because of circumstances. When you have to flee, you go to wherever you have means to get to. There is a good film called A Girl from Mogadishu. It's about Ifra Ahmed, who came to Ireland as an unaccompanied minor. If you watch that film, you will understand some of the choices and the opportunities or lack thereof for people who are fleeing. She didn't even know where she was going until she arrived in Ireland, that she was coming to Ireland. And so have a watch that document. I would highly recommend that you watch that documentary. It will also explain some of the things that the far-right organizers and government officials and ministers will be talking about when they talk about people who don't have their passports, for instance, who arrive without passports. It's not always possible for a person fleeing persecution to go to a government and ask for a passport. So if you were persecuted by your government, for instance, you wouldn't be expected to go to them and ask them to issue a passport so that you can run away from them. It's just simply illogical. And so people in some cases actually have to use fake identity documentation if they can get them in order to get to a place of safety. And historically, asylum seekers do declare that they came here with a fake document if they did, and they might even submit it to officials in the International Protection Office. So all the media hoopla about people coming with fake documents is just manufacturing that kind of hostility towards asylum seekers. We know in general that they've always treated asylum seekers with suspicion, which is one of the reasons why people were denied, for instance, access to a driving license, because it would give you an official identity document, and the state wanted to maintain that sort of suspicion over people. And that suspicion, we see it coming to the fore when we speak to public officials. The Taoiseach, for instance, was asked a question in the Dáil, former Taoiseach, I should say, Leo Varadkar at the time. He was asked, why is the government treating Ukrainians more favorably than other refugees? And his answer was that they are coming here legally. And by implication, he's telling the public that everybody else who is here seeking safety isn't coming here legally, which is simply not true. But it's that kind of anti-migrant dog whistles that facilitates and empowers the far-right organizers to go into communities and creates that suspicion in the communities. And so it makes it very easy for a person who knows nothing about migration and asylum, why people move, to take on that message, to lash onto that message. And so that's why a lot of the far-right organizers are able to get people to go and march on the streets and chanting, get them out. They were literally banging windows and doors in some of the centers and blocking buses that were taking people into the centers, primarily because the state uses that kind of rhetoric. And so these were the state responses that we would get from the state, measures that they would adopt, measures that they view as deterrent factors. And so they might cut welfare entitlements. You will see that again in the news recently. They are cutting welfare payments for Ukrainians with a view of trying to get to reduce the number of Ukrainians coming in. But they were also talking about Ukrainians voluntarily going back. I mean, why would you go back to a conflict zone? We asked TD, Brett Smith asked the Minister for Justice for statistics for the last 12 months of the number of people who were refused permission to land at Irish ports of entry. We only got data for Dublin, which is the main port of entry. And that data shows us that there were a significant number, hundreds of people from Somalia, Sudan, Afghanistan, Syria, including Palestine, who were returned, who were refused permission to land in Ireland. And that's concerning for us because it demonstrates the shift in Irish public policy when it comes to receiving people fleeing those kinds of situations in those countries. And that is worrying for us because the direction of travel seems to suggest that they will be opting into the migration pact in the EU, the EU's migration and asylum pact, which actually introduces something much worse than direct provision, which is detention at the border while a person is being processed. When the asylum claim is being processed, they will never be allowed to set foot in Ireland in legal theory. They will still be in Ireland, but if they are detained at the border, they are legally not in Ireland, and they will be processed there. And be sent back if they are rejected. And we are very concerned about that. The access to legal advice, for instance, access to independent legal advice, access to quality interpretation for people who don't speak the English language. Do they know their rights? We always worry when people are only interacting with state and not non-state actors, because at the border, we know already there are very few checks and balances. The border officials have a wide range of discretionary power to decide who they allow and who they do not allow. If you look suspicious, heaven knows what looks suspicious, they could simply refuse you permission to land. If they say they don't believe that you are here for the reasons that you claim to be here for, they could literally refuse you permission to land. We know from experience that they've rejected asylum claims on the basis that people needed to prove their sexual orientation. For instance, I don't know how we go about proving that you are gay. And so when we move towards that, introducing that border procedure, we'd be very worried about Ireland. Generally, Ireland has the power to choose whether or not they opt into the migration and asylum laws of the EU, and we'd be urging politicians, if you have a politician's ear, we would urge you to contact them and ask them actually not to reject the government's proposal for Ireland to opt into the EU and asylum migration process, but also for sovereignty reasons, because it's much easier to respond to a migration and asylum changing circumstances with domestic legislation when things change and you need. This is called exploring direct provision. So all the things that I was talking about, the language used by the government, the dog whistle that we are getting from cabinet ministers, we've seen that when they were establishing the system of direct provision. This is a letter from Minister O'Donoghue, again saying that Ireland is being warned by other EU states that Ireland was a soft touch, that their welfare system was serving as a magnet for refugees, and they needed to change that. That's when they were introducing the system of direct provision. So if you go to Twitter and put in, or X, you put in exploring DP, you'll be able to find archives of these documentations, and you have a read there for some of the language that we picked up. Again, that language is coming through from our new Taoiseach, Simon Harris, suggesting that third country processing of asylum seekers is worth considering. That's basically the UK and Rwanda type of arrangement where you want to process asylum claims in a third country. And that's concerning for us because for all the reasons that people have been campaigning against in the UK, because we don't know what circumstances in those countries, what rights situations would be. In fact, in Rwanda, if you came from Rwanda and claimed asylum in the UK, you have a higher chance of getting refugee status if you come from Rwanda. So the idea that Rwanda would be safe for anybody to go in and seek asylum is horrendous for us. Asylum seekers in general in Ireland would experience isolation and poverty, and that poverty is going to be exacerbated by the proposed cuts to the petty weekly allowance. They are reviewing that 38.80 euro for asylum seekers that people are getting. I suspect that they might even cut it and revert back to 21 euro 60 cents. Now, you can imagine if you have a child and who goes to the same schools as everybody else, you would have needs that need to be met, and you won't be able to meet those needs, especially if you are not allowed to work in the country for about 6 months before you can be allowed to work. And if you receive a first instance decision, you will not be allowed to work ever until your status has been determined once you have received the final decision on your asylum claim. So all these issues are missing when we read about the government's pronouncements. A lot of their talks seems to be much more focused at deterring people. They're not talking about the rights of asylum seekers. They're not talking about the situation of people in the direct provision system, which we have consistently campaigned against, condemned by various human rights bodies, including 2 UN committees, even domestic institutions such as the Special Rapporteur on Child Protection also issued reports calling for an end to the system of direct provision, but we're not seeing that the government had committed to that. But that's again been put under the carpet at the moment. We've seen horrendous community. This is a bathroom, actually. Showers for single men. People are expected, never mind the walls, but people are expected to use that with no shred of privacy whatsoever. Again, nobody's talking about these conditions in the operators of these direct provision centers. While the conditions are deteriorating, their income is actually increasing. We've seen record payouts to operators of direct provision centers, and they get paid not for physical space, but for the number of people that they have. So you have an incentive there to put in as many bunk beds as you can to maximize your profits. What we see in the government rhetoric at the moment, well, talking about getting rid of tents, they're talking about putting even the framing of this removal of the tents is quite horrendous, because the government was saying it's illegal to be putting out those tents. You're associating, again, asylum seekers with something that's illegal, that's not desirable, and yet they didn't choose to be left homeless by the government. It's the government's responsibility to actually house them, and they are violating international human rights law that Ireland has voluntarily signed up to by not providing them with accommodation. And yet the government doesn't talk about that illegality, the illegality of the government's conduct. They talk about the illegality of the asylum seekers' conduct. And that's worrying for us, because when we talk about integration into the social, political, and economic life of the country, it becomes very difficult if you are living in those kind of situations. So I'll pause then. We might engage more in the questions and answers.
Hi, everyone. I'm coming at this from a very different perspective, which is the on-the-ground perspective, and it's more to do with working with local white Irish people than it is to working with people who are refugees or IPAS asylum seekers, because that's not what our organisation does. It doesn't. Obviously, we have a whole mix of people as participants in the organisation, but we're not a refugee centre, and we're not receiving any funding in that regard. Our funding is around community development. So we have been delivering development education, global citizenship education for decades now. So it's taken a long time to evolve into where we are today. And so we're in James Joy Street at the moment, which is between Talbot Street and Sean McDermott Street in the north inner city of Dublin, which is quite notorious in and of itself for all sorts of other things. Okay, so the project we have, like, we run a creche, youth club, adult education program, an early school, kind of a youth reach. So we work with about 250 people a week. So we deal with large numbers. We're not a one-to-one organisation. We're into group work and processing work with people in groups, and I suppose our prime aim is to develop spaces where people can take positive community action for themselves. So what we do is we provide training and education programs in GCE for seldom heard people in the NEIC, and I'll explain seldom heard in a minute. We facilitate residents and local other community workers, youth workers, childcare workers to connect and critically engage with local and global injustice and inequality issues. We create positive change through taking informed community action, and we try to build the capacity of practitioners to develop and deliver GCE community education through a wide variety of innovative and non-formal education programs. So as I say, we've been doing this for a long time. If this is the kind of work you want to get into, I would advise accessing as much training as you can from people who've done it before, because there are some very excellent, like, tried and tested methodologies as to how to integrate this work into what you do. I hope by the time I get to the end that you'll have a greater sense as to why we do what we do and how we do it. Won't even pretend to try and preach to any of you, because you're all hugely experienced in your own field. What I will do is pose questions and tell you what we've done. And I'll ask you a lot of questions that are maybe worth taking back with you to your own organisation. And these are probably questions that evolved within our organisation, again, like I said, over years and years, and got us to the point where we are today doing what we're doing. So it didn't happen overnight, that's for sure. So the first thing to say is that the census of 2022 was shows that the population in the northeastern inner city, which is kind of from O'Connell Street to the canal, Dorset Street down to the IFSC, and there was a 19% increase, which is fairly big now for any community. I mean, 45,000 is a huge population anyway, in the size of, I don't know, a third of Cork City or something. But a 19% increase is huge, and particularly when the national increase was only 8%. The disadvantaged population has increased by 15%. Now, like the area there you can see in the bottom, and this information came from ICON, the Inner City Organisations Network, who analysed the census data, which has been really useful for all of us. But the 19% increase, there hasn't really been new housing built in that amount of time. So you have to think it's people who've moved into the area, and we would see a huge increase in the population. And I can see there actually this is the population of white Irish as opposed to migrants. So it's very, it changes as you go around the area. For instance, in Sheriff Street, the number of migrants living in that area, minority ethnic community, is very low, whereas in Parnell Street it's very high. So it's not like a whole area approach. The other feature, which I think is probably replicated around the country, is that social housing that isn't newish in the last maybe 5 or so years, is predominantly white, occupied by white Irish, because even when people get older, they make sure that other members of their family take over the flat, let's say, before they die, before it's passed on to anybody else. So it's incredibly difficult, like if not impossible, for anybody who's not already living in a social housing in our patch to get one, unless there's new housing built. And there was new housing built even up the street from us of late in the last 5 years. And you will probably know that like the amount of work that was done prior to that in terms of integrating families who weren't white Irish into that complex was zero, which meant there was also teething problems when that happened, because people suddenly found themselves living in a complex which they had only lived with white Irish before, and now they're living in a mixed race community without any preparation of any sort at all. So I suppose our ethos is to work with white Irish primarily to change minds, to change, so, you know, I'll go on, but I'm not a great fan of the word far right. I'm not suggesting for a second they don't exist, but I do feel that people are labelled with that label. And once you label people, it can be very hard for them to go backwards and unlabel themselves even, when in fact sometimes, and in our experience, a lot of the time, they're just asking legitimate questions. Because, and I'll keep going to the next one, but so we ask ourselves, like, what is social inclusion? And both the last two speakers talked about it. So we ask, who's been included into what? And should we investigate what we assume is the cultural baseline in Ireland that others are being included into? Should we promote interculturalism? Should we explore the exclusion of white Irish marginalised people as exclusion from education, private healthcare, etc., and particularly decision-making spaces? Now, one of the things I say that I know is going to be controversial, because I've said it in loads of places and very few people agree with me, but I will tell you that I lived in London for 10 years around the 80s and 90s, and I was a white Irish immigrant. As such, I had the advantage of being white, and I do think we need to talk about colour a bit more, because colour does matter in that it is more difficult to be integrating into a virtually white country if you're a person of colour. So in London, I mean, first of all, the whole setup was completely different, and we're totally unprepared in this country, but we should be learning from other countries and not starting from scratch in this country, and at such speed as well, which is what we're finding ourselves in the middle of. So, you know, the various different boroughs in London set up organisations for practically every different culture in their borough, and we have none of that here, except there probably is a Bosnian community organisation, I think. But there's an assumption that, for instance, all Black people are from the same culture, which of course is not true at all, no more than it's true that all white people in London are from the same culture either. But as an immigrant myself, I knew that, you know, even after the 10 years that I was there, probably 80% of my friends were Irish. And I feel strongly that we should be funding different cultural groups to organise themselves so that they can feel more at home here, settle in, have supports from their extended family, extended country people, even before I start thinking about integration. Many people are living in circumstances that are pretty dire, and they don't have the space in their head even to consider the notion of social inclusion in any way other than surviving from day to day. So the far right, I mean, like I was saying, I have a bit of an issue with this label, but if you're going to start this work, you really have to, first of all, educate yourself and be confident in answering the following questions. So who are the far right and how big are they? And we know, in fact, that the far right are very small, and I'll show you some stats in the next slide about that. We need to be very, I mean, one of the things we've learned here is that local people, white people who've lived here for generations, are absolutely furious at being labelled as far right, when in fact they were asking questions about their own worries and their concerns about cost of living, not being able to access housing, not being, not having the resources to access third level, because in this community there's been a huge improvement in people's interest in staying in education and wanting to access third level. You need to build on the increased number of people who are now becoming aware of the unequal society in which we live, and create awareness of who is actually excluding marginalized people from access to services or decision-making spaces. So what I mean about that is that we really should celebrate the number of people who are talking about politics now. It's way bigger than it ever was. And even if they're talking in a negative way, because actually it's a great opportunity to get people to understand who the real decision makers are and to use their vote the next time there's an election. So voting is one of the things, voter education is one of the things we spend a lot of time on. And the last time there was a general election, we got 600 new people registered to vote, because the vote level in the north of the city is very, very low. I think it was the lowest in the country at the last election. And if people don't vote, then they have no say. And of course, people are not voting because they think, what's the point? All politicians are the same, etc., etc. So we spend a lot of time educating people about one vote and why one vote can matter, and how you can use your vote and use your access to politicians to express all your worries and queries, rather than using that energy against the people they think are responsible for all their worries and queries, which are migrants and minority ethnic communities. So the experience on the ground here over the last few years, I mean, some of it is quite shocking, definitely sad. And I've been here now for nearly 30 years. So, sad probably is the biggest word I'd use, and more than sad, very worrying. So the change in behavior we've seen is, like for our youth club, parents suddenly walking their child down the street to come into our club. These are like 10 or 12-year-olds, when in fact those same 10 or 12-year-olds would normally be out in the street from the age of 4, maybe unsupervised. And now they think the streets are dangerous. Their child might be abducted. It's just crazy kind of thinking. The fear that the streets are unsafe because of immigrants, so they won't come into evening classes, particularly in the winter. And telling their children not to play with minority ethnic community children. Now, we have a huge drug problem in the area. It doesn't make sense even normally. If you're going to be worried about the safety of the streets, and the streets of the north inner city, I'm sorry to say, are not safer. I mean, I think all our community workers would say that. In my time here, it's certainly got an awful lot worse. But it's not from the increased number of migrants living in the area. It's from the drug dealing, which is all pervasive and dangerous, and people are carrying guns. But instead of blaming the lack of services for people, preventative services or treatment services for people on drugs, they just so quickly say, yeah, it's the migrants who are living in the area, because there is a huge number, an increase. I haven't actually done a slide on that, but the numbers of migrants in the area is ginormous, and the influx is, you're into thousands in a very short space of time, in a very small space, particularly Gardiner Street, Talbot Street, Amiens Street, probably 2,000 over a 6-month period. So, we are still a little village, really, even though the population is quite big, but the northern city operates like a village mentality as opposed to a suburbia of like Blanchardstown, let's say. So people's perceptions have changed, and I've never seen as much anger in the country, really, as I have in the last few years. So, instead of, again, using that anger against the people, the decision makers, they're saying, simple to say immigrants are the cause of all the changes in Ireland, like less housing, can't access your GP, the waiting lists are too long. And this notion which I have to say I blame Trump for, is that Ireland was a great country before immigrants arrived. This is a loss of traditional Irish values. You know, again, you get people into a room and you explain, is that like, was Ireland a great country before immigrants arrived? You just get really factual about it. And no, it wasn't. Look at all the abuse in the church, all the abuse in the mother and baby homes. Ireland wasn't this great notion country where we were all dancing at crossroads and playing guitar and violin or something and singing along. Most people were living in poverty for generations in this country. So again, it's about reminding people of that whatever they say, that the facts of what they're saying may not be true. I mean, the big one, immigrants are using up resources, so there's less for the rest of us. And again, you know, the population increase is very low compared to the reduction in the level of services that have been made that affect all of us. So our challenge, and the challenge we give ourselves all the time, is to divert the anger towards the decision makers that have reduced community medical education services for the poorest. And actually it works. That's the first thing I will say. I'll get on to you later now. It's not simple, and I'm not saying I have the magic wand. I'll show you why it and how it works and how we have learned to do it. But we have seen very positive results. So that's worth holding on to. Things can change, and we can be the people who affect that change. Okay.
That's 1 minute, Sarah. Thank you.
Jesus. Okay, sorry. I'll keep going. All right. So behind the fear is people genuinely complaining about the lack of social education, etc., etc., and young people feeling left out of the housing market, and people, you know, families seeing their young people immigrating to find better employment or housing opportunities abroad, and that's all hurting people here at home. If you haven't heard of the Hope and Courage Collective, please do. I mean, I won't read too much of that then, but they have a huge amount of resources, but they will tell you that only 1% of people fully agree with far right. 11% of people agree with most. That means 90% of us do not agree with them. And you have to hold on to those figures, not feeling the far right are taking over all of us. And most people believe that the wealthy are successful because they were given more opportunities than others, that working class people struggle to succeed because the rules are rigged against them, and the Black, Asian, minority ethnic people face bigger structural barriers to success than white people. They speak for themselves. So what we do is we enable people to examine their own biases and assumptions. We create a safe space where people can articulate their issues without judgment, and that means letting people come in and say racist things so that they can honestly explore them rather than having to hide it and say nothing and still walking out feeling it's all the migrants' fault, the immigrants' fault. We empower migrant communities to become engaged and active members of our own organisation and the rest of organisations in the area. There's a fantastic resource called Guide for Inclusive Community Engagement and Local Planning and Decision Making. Now, the seldom heard are the people we engage with, and if you haven't heard that term before, some of us here in this room are the seldom heard at some parts of our lives. So they're basically people whose voice is not heard, not listened to by the people who make the decisions. And if you don't vote, of course, your voice is definitely not heard. But also, it means that when it comes to community engagement, you're not consulted with. Other people make the decisions for your community. And I talked about the voter education. So my mantra all the time when I'm in those spaces is stop doing things to us and start doing things with us. But it doesn't happen. The other issue, I suppose a passion of mine, is othering. And othering refers to the process whereby an individual or groups of people attribute negative characteristics to other individuals or groups of people to set them apart and reduce their status as human beings. So once you start othering people, they become lesser people, and you give yourself permission then to treat them less equal than you would treat your sister, your brother, your family. And there's so much othering going on. As soon as you talk about them, when you're talking about anybody that's not like yourself, in my case, I'm Irish, white. So if I start talking those Black people, those people over there, you're subconsciously giving yourself permission to treat them less well than they need to be treated. And we need to really watch this and challenge it at every space we can. We do a lot of work on media sources because people are not reading papers anymore, hardly. They're getting it all online. So we do a huge amount of work on fake news, how to recognize it. We do another piece of work about, if you're just chatting with your neighbour on the street, check if what they're saying is true. And the biggest thing of all is that the change requires one-to-one discussion, debate, interaction in a safe space with no judgment. You can't change the minds of groups of people. You can only ever enable a person themselves to change their own mind. And that's a real principle that we operate from. So what we do, we use all sorts of creative methodologies to do all the things I've just said, or art, drama, theatre of the oppressed. We have young people doing it. We have the only minority ethnic community Gashka group in Ireland, apparently, at the moment. We have group work games, like a walking debate, practical workshops, drama for children in our creche, international cooking, and we have a peer community of practice for anybody who'd like to join it if they want to learn other ways of delivering development or global citizenship education. That's actually the meat of what we do. The stained glass, for instance, up there, we had a class who made 7 of the SDGs into stained glass, 3 of how they wanted the world to look, and 4 how the world is today. Like there's a woman there looking at an empty fridge. We did a theatre session. And again, at that, we had hardcore local people who had fairly negative views of migrants coming into their community. But by the end of it, they were on stage and speaking up about the great multicultural community the North Inner City is becoming. Promote one action concept, which is what can I do? Sometimes people get overwhelmed and they don't know what they can do in a positive way. We always push it back to what can I do? Like I'm drinking from a plastic bottle today, which I would normally never do, but stop buying one plastic bottle will be one less plastic bottle in the ocean, and we go through that. So from your own organisation, you need to ask yourself, how many minority ethnic people are among your staff, your board of directors, or volunteers? Does it represent your local demographics? Do the pictures, photos, images on your wall reflect a diverse community? Do the resources in your organisation reflect a diverse community? And the changes you can make, you need to advertise vacancies in media platforms that will attract minority ethnic communities. Go to agencies where minority ethnic communities are hang out to advertise your work. Don't wait for them to come to you. Set yourself a target and a deadline for making any changes, because otherwise it won't happen. And the big one at the end is, you know this, if you do the same thing over and over again, you cannot expect a different outcome. So, for instance, even in our community, people agreed we would all make huge efforts to include more minority ethnic community people on our boards. And you know what? It hasn't really happened. You have to decide you want to do something different to make it happen and set yourself a deadline. If you keep doing the same things, nothing will change. I know that sounds obvious, but I really would ask people to think about that, because what we do, the way we work, suits us white Irish. It may not suit people of different cultural diversity from different countries at all. So that's my bit. Thank you.